All right. Welcome to NOAA Live. My name is Grace Simpkins, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. And this series is sponsored by NOAA's Regional Collaboration Network, which is spread across the country and helps connect people to all that NOAA does. It's also sponsored by Woods Hole Sea Grant, where I work, which is located at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution here on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. To find out about future webinars, please take a look at the Woods Hole Sea Grant Education website, or you can just follow us on Facebook. Believe it or not, I can't believe it, this is our 29th webinar in a series designed to help you get to know NOAA and some of our incredible experts during these months of school closures. All of our speakers work for some part of NOAA, and those of you that have been on this before know that that stands for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Now today, it is my pleasure to be introducing you to one of my favorite educators, Chris Patrone, who is from NOAA's Delaware Sea Grant in Lewis, Delaware. Now, while we'll be talking with Chris about NOAA's role in understanding the coast and horseshoe crabs, we want to recognize that we are all coming to you from the traditional lands of Native communities who have substantial traditional and local knowledge and much to share with us. We acknowledge that Chris is coming to us from the land of the Nanacook Nation, and we are hosting this webinar from the ancestral lands of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and the Wampanoag tribe of Gay-Hedequina. Now, a few guidelines, same as they always are. Before I hand it over to Chris, you're all muted. We have a lot of people on the line, and we want to make sure that everybody can hear Chris. However, as you've already discovered, there is a box where you can write questions. We encourage you to write questions throughout the whole webinar. I'll be keeping track of them for Chris, and he'll be stopping periodically to answer a few. We might not get to all of your questions, but we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Now, enough of me talking. I know you really want to hear about horseshoe crabs, and you want to hear from Chris. So Chris, they're all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Grace. That was a great intro. I'm happy to be here talking to you all. I'm excited talking about one of my favorite animals, marine animals ever, the horseshoe crab. And so we're going to start the presentation. Blue blood, green eggs, and red knots is an amazing story of the horseshoe crab. And we'll get to each one of those items there in the title as we move through today's talk. So as Grace mentioned, I'm coming to you from Lewis, Delaware. So we see the east coast of the United States here on the screen. And inside that box is Lewis, Delaware. So right in the middle of the Atlantic seaboard there. It's exciting. It's a great place to be. We have access to marshes and the ocean and the bay, all right here in Lewis. It's a great spot. And it's a great spot, especially to talk about horseshoe crabs. I'll tell you why in a little bit. The screen is dark on purpose, and that's we're going to set the stage here a little bit. I want you to imagine yourself on a beach in the middle of the night. You can hear the waves, but it's not an ocean wave, a big ocean wave. These are small, tiny little waves that are characteristic of Delaware Bay, Chesapeake Bay, Hudson Bay, the North Carolina Sounds. Little tiny waves, you can smell the ocean, you can smell the marsh, and you hear this sound, this rustling, this sort of scraping sound. So you take your flashlight and you sort of move your flashlight around the beach. And all of a sudden you see this. You see piles and piles of these things, these big shells that maybe you've never seen before. You hear the sounds, you smell the smells, and you wonder, are you in a movie? Are you on another planet? These are the horseshoe crabs that come up on our beaches every year that we're going to talk about today. So currently on our planet, there are 4 species of horseshoe crabs. Most of the 3 of the species you can see there in the orange, the yellow, and the blue, their ranges typically over in Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Western Pacific, and the Eastern Indian Ocean. And you see one species all by itself, the green species there, Limulus polyphemus, which lines essentially from Maine to Louisiana and then around the Yucatan Peninsula. And the center of that population, where there's no higher abundance of horseshoe crabs, of any 4 species of horseshoe crabs, is right here in Delaware Bay. So I'm going to take a trip back in time. I want you to imagine yourself going back in time quite a distance just to talk about or to discover one of the horseshoe crab's oldest relatives. And that's the trilobite, which was on our planet around 540 to 500 million years ago. Scientists have tied the trilobites to the current horseshoe crabs, Limulus polyphemus, and the other 4 species, these critters roamed the planet, right? Roamed in our ocean, roamed on the beach, and they were tiny, 500 million years ago. Fast forward a bit to about 445 million years ago, and we see fossil evidence of Lunataspis aurora. Okay, much smaller. You see about an inch and a half in the fossil record, but again, an important ancestor of today's horseshoe crabs. Fast forward a little bit further to 250 million years ago, we see 2 different species, Paleolimulus and Europroops. Again, tiny fossils there. You see about an inch and a half. The one on the bottom there is the size of a penny. Super important. And these 2 species here on the right are found now during the time of the dinosaurs. We see dinosaurs come into play around 230 million years ago. So when you hear the horseshoe crab referenced as a living fossil, its ancestors actually predate dinosaurs. So a question for you all to enter into the chat, A, B, C, or D. How big do today's horseshoe crabs get? Given that we see these ancestors that were only about an inch and a half to 2 inches and even smaller. So Grace, can you read out for me what some of the folks have to say?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how big do today's horseshoe crabs get? And we have a lot of responses coming in. We have a lot of B's, Lucas saying B, and excuse me, James and Duncan. So we have a couple B's. We have a lot of C's. I would say that the majority are saying C. Lillian is saying that, and Jackie's saying that. Lydia is saying that. Christopher, Haley, Lindy. We have a couple of D's. If you include the tail, someone said. Angela said that, but I would say C is the overwhelming majority.
Excellent. Yeah, I knew we'd have a sharp group here today, and the answer is C. On average, our adult horseshoe crabs get to be about 14 to 20 inches. And I'll show you some pictures of some larger ones throughout the slideshow. So enter about 20 million years ago, and we see the appearance in the fossil record of our Atlantic horseshoe crab, Limulus polyphemus. It's an important species ecologically, environmentally, and to humans, and we'll talk about that. But first, I want to take a quick break. I'm going to cut my screen, and I want to make sure to answer any questions that have popped up at this point.
Yeah, I'm glad you took a break, Chris, because we have a pretty savvy crew, and they have some questions already. So an interesting question came in from Luke, and he's wondering, what sound does a horseshoe crab make? Do they have vocalizations?
Typically, they do not. It's a great question. They do not vocalize in any way. Oftentimes, the noises that are associated with horseshoe crabs are, again, that scraping of the shells, right? So you can see in this picture here, you can't see in this picture, but in the picture that I'll bring back up in a second, you can see the scrape marks that are all over these animals. And that comes a lot of times during the spawning time, just through sort of day-to-day living in the ocean, but they don't actually make any vocalization.
Great. And actually, looking at if you wouldn't mind pulling that picture just back up again, Sarah's asking, and I think I told you I thought someone would ask this, so I'm glad that you did, Sarah. What is that blobby stuff on the back? And also, where are the eyes? So if you're going to get to that, Chris, then you can tell Sarah to hold on, or if you want to answer that question right now, you can.
No, we can answer that now, and I'll show you again when I show you the model of the horseshoe crab I have here in my office. So the one question there, where are the eyes? If you can see my mouse, this is one of 2 main compound eyes. The other one's sort of on the other side, can't really see it. These are compound eyes, okay? And they are pretty interesting because they have rods and cones like the human eyes do, but they're much bigger rods and cones. And I'll talk about medical research in a little bit, but that eye is super important in terms of human research. They also have a series of light sensors that are located on the top of the shell, through the tail, the telson, and actually they have some light sensors, UV light sensors that are underneath that they use to sense new moon, full moon, the sun, those kinds of things, day, night, periodicity. And so their sensory system, while they can't talk or vocalize in any way, their sight and their sensory, light sensory is super important and super sensitive. The first question there about the things that are all over the back end there, that's a great question. So we can tell, and I'll ask this question in a little bit, But you can tell this is an older horseshoe crab. And I can tell that because of these things that are growing on the back of it. Those are called slipper shells or slipper limpets. They have a bunch of different names, but those are slipper shells. And what happens there is once the horseshoe crab stops molting, things will start to colonize on that shell because it's a great spot. The horseshoe crab's always moving around, so it's always finding good water to live in. And these slipper shells move around and actually feed on some of the things, the bacteria, some of the plant life, the phytoplankton that will be found on the shell of the horseshoe crab. And so you can sometimes see barnacles, you can sometimes see blue mussels, all sorts of things start to live on the horseshoe crab. It doesn't hurt the horseshoe crab for the most part. Sometimes we'll see limpets and things that attach to the gills, which is not real good for the horseshoe crab, but for the most part, they tend to hang out right on top. It's a great question.
Great. So I just want to share a couple of questions and just let folks know that Chris is going to get to that. What do they eat? He's going to get to that in his talk when he continues on. And also, someone was asking about their eggs. I know that Chris is going to get to that as well. So they're asking why they lay green eggs, and I'll let you answer that when you get to that part of your talk. But one of the questions that came up that Jared had is the length that you had them vote on. Did that length include the tail or the telson? Was it the whole animal?
That's a good question. No, it doesn't include the telson. So that body can be up to 20 inches. That's a great question, that main shell. And then the telson can be another 12 inches, 15 inches in some cases, depending on the size of the animal.
Great. And just one more question, because I think this is a great question as well. Lydia asks, if they're on the beach, so if they're out of the water, do they still survive or do they depend on staying in the water?
That's a great question. We'll get to some of that in a little bit. The fact that the horseshoe crabs do come out of the water. As long as those gills that are underneath the body stay wet, they are an intertidal animal. So they can move in and out of water with no problem. Again, as long as those gills stay wet.
Great. And a lot of people have questions about their tails and their telsons. So I'm just going to tell you, stay tuned because Chris is going to go there. So I'm going to hold on. This is such a great savvy crew with so many great questions that don't worry, I'm keeping track and we'll stop again. So go ahead, Chris. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all for those great questions. So let's talk about the horseshoe crab body itself. Here's a close-up shot that I took a bunch of years ago of a horseshoe crab. And you can see a lot of great detail here. And I'm going to use my mouse to sort of point out some of this. So I mentioned already the book gills. Those are here, right here. And why do they call it book gills? Well, they look like pages in a book. And I'll show you in a second, they flap those gills to not only exchange gases, but to also swim. Not many people know the horseshoe crabs can swim. So up here in the front, you see two feeder claws. They have a special name that I'm not going to get into, but these claws are the ones that move around the bottom and they pick up little food bits. They're feeling around as the horseshoe crab walks around. And then you see something really cool here. And there's this sort of bristly area right in the middle. That's the entrance to the horseshoe crab's mouth. And those bristles, imagine if your elbows had bristles on the end. And in order for you to start to digest your food, you had to rub these bristles around to start that digestion process. They act sort of like teeth. They start that breakdown process. And inside that sort of area there is the mouth. And that those legs will sort of move around and move that food into the mouth. I have a video that I'm going to switch to. It gets into this really well. And I took this video again a few years ago. And it showed, it's a little dark, I apologize for that. But you'll see.
Chris, you'll want to unmute yourself. You are still muted right now.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so this is me feeding a horseshoe crab a few years ago, a little piece of squid. You can see those initial feeder claws sort of manipulate that food a little bit. They move it around, and then those bristles take over. And I'm going to show it again.
You're remuted again.
I am, aren't I? Okay.
Still muted, sorry. You'll want to unmute yourself, Chris. Sorry.
All right, guys. So again, moving that food into the mouth parts there, it starts to break down that process, and in just a few seconds, it's completely gone. It moves from there into the crop and the gizzard, where it further gets broken down, and then into the midgut, where all that nutrients gets collected. And so I am actually going to stop sharing. We're going to move back to the camera, and I want to show you my friend, the horseshoe crab. So this is not a real horseshoe crab. This is a model. It's plastic resin kind of stuff. And it's a great use. It's great to use in education because I can point out a lot of different things. So here's a giant, big horseshoe crab. You can see it's about twice the size of my head. And this is a model of a female horseshoe crab, which tends to be bigger than the males. And so you can spot the eyes there. There's that compound eye on either side. And you can just barely, I can see it. You probably can't. There's some 2 light sensors there. There's more in the back of the shell here. There's that telson. I know a lot of people had questions about that telson. Super important to the horseshoe crab. It doesn't act like a stingray barb. This is not venomous in any way. If you step on it, it's going to hurt. There's no question. And you might get a little bacteria infection around there, so it's really important to be careful around horseshoe crabs. But there's no venom. They're not going to inject anything into you. And that tail is super important because, as I mentioned, they swim. And they actually swim upside down. So they use those book gills there sort of flat, and that moves them as they swim. And this telson acts as a rudder. So they use it to provide direction while swimming. Now, another important feature of that tail, or another important use of that tail is, you've noticed, those of you who have been on the beach and seen a horseshoe crab, they tend to be upside down. They get flipped over by wave action. All of a sudden, it's upside down. It can't just pick itself up and turn itself over. It uses that tail and it bends it back and sort of, I can't do it with the model because it's plastic and hard, but it bends itself in half and uses that tail to sort of maneuver itself back into the walking orientation. And this, again, this is how it walks along the bottom there. And you can see it has some walking legs. It's got these ones in the back here are known as the pusher legs, and the females will use those to dig nests for the eggs. There's those book gills. And then if we zoom in real close, there is the entrance to the mouth, right? And so it's got that bristly area that starts the digestion process. And this model is really cool because I can do something neat with it. I can actually take it apart. And so you can see, pick up this area here. Again, this is the underneath side where the mouth is. And right here, we can see the crop and gizzard, right? So that's where the food goes and starts the digestion. And then here's the midgut here where all that nutrients starts to get absorbed. Super important. And then back behind here is actually its brain. Okay, so you can see its brain in this. Now, if I zoom in real close, you can see little dots. And again, I mentioned this is a model of the female. And so those little dots represent eggs that are all over the inside of the body. I'm going to switch over to the top part of the shell here. Right? So we have the top, and we look inside, and this shows us the circulatory system. And you can see here, there's the heart right there in the middle, and you can see all sort of the veins and the arteries that are moving through the inside of the horseshoe crab. And we'll get to its blood a little bit. I think there's going to be some questions about blood, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But that is the internal and external anatomy of a horseshoe crab. And Grace, I would love to take any questions about that if any have popped up.
I'm glad that you have paused because there have been questions coming in left, right, and center. Now, I've been trying to answer some as we go, but a couple of interesting questions that I think you'll want to address. So Sophia first asked, is a horseshoe crab really a crab? Which a couple of people have asked that. So I thought you'd, yeah.
Yeah, that's a super good question. They are not actual crabs, right? So we think of blue crabs, spider crabs, hermit crabs, all sorts of these other crabs that have that name. And a horseshoe crab is not a crab at all. It's related. You can find some common ancestors there, but they're more closely related to spiders and scorpions, those kinds of things, sea spiders and land spiders and scorpions, which has some interesting implications in terms of its anatomy and physiology. And so, yeah, they are not true crabs as some blue crab or as blue crabs are and things, but they are more closely related to spiders and scorpions. It's a good question.
Great. And Christopher asked, do they have a nose?
It's a good question. Christopher, great name. They don't have a nose per se. but they do have different organs. Again, like those light sensors, they have different sensors sort of on the bottom, not so much on the top, that can smell. So they take in that sort of that olfactory. They can take in smells, but they don't have a nose, sort of like we do. Yep. Good question.
Great. And Simone wonders, how heavy are they?
Yeah. So they can get heavy, right? So this one is pretty darn accurate to how heavy a horseshoe crab is. And so in the couple of pounds region, a lot of times when we find them on the beach, they might have sand in them, or they might be sort of waterlogged, have a bunch of little puddles in them. So they can be a little bit heavier. But, you know, 5-ish pounds maybe. They're not light, but they're not crazy heavy.
Great. Now, a lot of people are asking this, so I'm just going to go ahead and answer it. I answered it for a few, but why are they called horseshoe crabs? And you can correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but it's because their shape is like a horseshoe, right? And that someone thought they looked like a horseshoe.
Yep, exactly. So they resemble that horse's foot. And so it's got that sort of that U shape, and then it's got sort of a big top. So if you look at a horse's foot, very similar in shape to a horseshoe.
Okay, 2 more questions. One of them, a couple of different folks are asking what they're made out of. So, for example, our nose is made out of cartilage. Our fingernails are made out of keratin. What's that horseshoe crab shell made out of?
Yep, like most arthropods, this shell, not so much this one because it's plastic, but in real life, horseshoe crabs and blue crabs and all sorts of other critters in the sea, their shell is made of calcium carbonate, and it's got chitin in there, and so there's a bunch of different materials that make up a shell, and these are characteristic of critters that have an exoskeleton. So unlike humans that have bone and cartilage on the inside, arthropods have an exoskeleton, so their skeletons on the outside to protect them and give them structure. It's a great question.
Great. Now, the last question I was hoping somebody would ask, so I was really glad that I think Lydia asked this, but a couple of different people have asked. And she was saying that she often finds dead ones on the beach. Mm-hmm. And somebody else was, mentioning, why do we find so many dead ones? Mm-hmm. So I thought you could address what we typically find on the beach.
Yep. There's a couple things that can happen here. Horseshoe crabs, the ones we see on the beach in huge numbers, particularly this time of year, could be dead. They could have made their way up on the beach and just flipped over, and they couldn't right themselves and get back into the water, so they dry out, unfortunately. Sometimes these horseshoe crabs die in the water, and then through wave action and currents will get brought up on the beach. Okay, so it died in the water and gets moved up on land. But a lot of times, and you really need to be careful, because a lot of times those dead horseshoe crabs, the ones we think are dead on the beach, are actually molts. And so we'll talk about this in a little bit, but horseshoe crabs, in order to grow, much like blue crabs and other things, they'll molt that exoskeleton. And I just happen to have a molt here. This is a probably 4 to 5-year-old horseshoe crab that has molted. And the telltale sign of a molt is, if you look real close, this front part is open. Okay, I'm not doing it justice here, but it's sort of open, and that opening is created, and the growing horseshoe crab will actually move out of that opening, and that shell will harden up, and in a few weeks or months, depending on how old it is, it'll molt again and again and again. So yeah, there's a bunch of different ways we can see horseshoe crabs on the beach, and they're either dead, they couldn't flip over, they're dead in the water and they got washed up on shore, or you're finding molts. And if you're looking for crabs, again, look for that opening in the front, and that'll be a telltale sign of a molt.
Great. And I know if you live in my local area, right here on Cape Cod, we often find, especially after a storm, a lot of those molts on the beach. They're a really fun thing to go out and collect. Sometimes people will put them in their garden. And so, yeah, it's something that folks up and down the seaboard, eastern seaboard, might be able to find. So thank you so much. I'm going to hold on to the questions at this point and let you go on, except to ask, because you showed us the horseshoe crab eating, and a lot of folks have asked what they eat. So
yeah, that's a good question. One of the sort of the hypotheses of why they have lived for so long, they've endured extinctions and just a lot of different, polluted water and the whole 9 yards. One of the reasons it's believed to be that because they are sort of omnivorous, they'll eat, particularly at the adult stage or the beyond the sort of larval stage, they'll eat clams and worms and crabs and dead material and all sorts of different things. So they're omnivores. They'll eat just about anything. When they're in their larval stage, they're eating sort of phytoplankton and zooplankton, again, depending on the size. But yeah, they'll eat just about anything that they can find. Dead fish, sometimes live fish if they're quick, but just all over the charts in terms of what they eat. It's a great question.
Great, thank you. I know you have a lot more to share, so we're going to let you keep going.
Great, thank you. So up next, let's talk about the calendar. So here we are in 2020. It's been a heck of a year so far. I'm going to highlight some dates here. This is sort of late April to early June or mid-June. You can see sort of shaded in yellow there. That represents the horseshoe crab spawning season. Okay, so that sort of mid-spring to early summer is when horseshoe crabs come up on the beaches to spawn. And I've shaded an area there of the calendar in sort of that orange shade there with 2 circles, and I'll talk about those circles in a minute. But this orange block of time, mid-May to early June, represents peak spawning season. So this is when we see those huge numbers of horseshoe crabs coming out of the water onto the beach. The pictures that I've shown so far of the mass spawning events, those typically are peak spawning events during this time frame. And those peak spawning events occur around moon phase. So that black dot there on May 22nd, that represents a new moon when we can't see the moon for various reasons. And then the open circle there on June 5th represents the full moon. And those 2 moon phases really do some interesting things. They change the level of tide, so we have higher high tides and lower low tides. And these together are called spring tides around the new and full moon. And on those nocturnal spring tides, sort of mid-May to early June, you'll see huge numbers of horseshoe crabs. It's by far the peak spawning event. And so we're at we're the 29th. So we're still in peak season, but we might not see a ton because we're not on a new or full moon phase. So I'm going to talk about these beaches and the spawning events here. So there's Delaware. Hopefully some of you get the chance to visit Delaware. We are the first state. You can look up why we're called the first state later. But I want to sort of narrow in on this zone here highlighted in yellow. And that's Pickering Beach, Delaware to Slaughter Beach, Delaware. And this is a really interesting spot in our state and in the country because here, this section here is where we see the highest number of spawning adults in Delaware. We have an equivalent sort of high populace over on the New Jersey side of Delaware Bay as well. But I'm going to focus on Delaware for this example. So we see that same picture, tons of horseshoe crabs, adults up on the beach, sort of piling on each other. There's some interesting things going on here. That female will come in to land on the sand, dig a nest, deposit eggs, which is going to be fertilized by a male, and bury that nest back up. Unfortunately, sometimes through wave action, tides, those things, those nests become uncovered and those eggs are sort of released into the water. Now, what you see here is a hand, sort of for size and sort of comparison. This is what's called the rack line. This is the best spot to go beachcombing, in the rack line, because that's where all the plant material, the shells, those kinds of things have been moved up the beach by the high tide line. It's also known as the high tide line. So in that rack line, you'll find horseshoe crabs. And you can see their little tiny green eggs. Someone asked why they were green. That has to do with a few things. Their yolk that's in the egg, but also, to a lesser extent, the blue blood, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But so there's the green eggs there. And those green eggs take about 2 to 4 weeks to hatch if they're in their nest, and are about 1/8 of an inch in size. Now, over the course of a couple weeks, you'll start to see what looks like a full-size horseshoe crab, but much smaller inside these eggs. Okay, and so eventually those larvae will hatch out of the eggs. That the high tide will pull those larvae back into the water, and they'll start their growing process. So after about 1 to 2 years, you can see the size there, about 1/2 inch to maybe 1 inch. These individuals at 1 to 2 years, they stay right there in Delaware Bay in sort of shallow water. They're feeding, they're molting, they're just growing, trying to survive. You can see some 2-year-old, 2 to 3-year-old horseshoe crabs here, maybe about 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches in some cases. And again, they're in Delaware Bay and they're in Chesapeake Bay and Hudson Bay, doing their thing, growing, eating. And then something interesting happens. Around 5 to 6 years old, these horseshoe crabs will move offshore into much deeper water, where they'll spend the next couple of years, 3, 4, 5 years, where they're feeding, and again, they're molting. And then once they reach about 8, 9, 10 years old, they'll move back into Delaware Bay as mature adults, and they'll start that process again. They'll go up on the beaches, they'll lay the eggs, fertilize the eggs, and continue to move about Delaware Bay. Typically in the wintertime, they'll move into deeper water because the shallow water gets colder than the deep water. And so they'll do their thing until they live out their life. So I have another video here, and I'm going to show you. Hold on just 1 second. So we captured this video a few years ago on a beach in Delaware. I believe it was South Towers Beach, where I spotted an egg, a developed egg. So we got the light on it, we got the camera out, and inside that egg, I'll show it again, you can see that horseshoe crab, that larval horseshoe crab moving around inside. We're not going to be able to show it there, but let's try here. So it's going to be a little choppier, I think, but again, you can see that horseshoe crab egg there. It's moving around inside the egg. And chances are that egg's going to hatch within the next few hours after I put it back down in the rack line there. And that, again, that larval horseshoe crab will move into the water and start its life. So I talked about the early stages. I talked about sort of the mid stages. Another question for you all. How long can today's horseshoe crabs live? A few options there, and Grace, you can keep an eye on the chat box and see what folks are entering.
I am so glad you asked this question, Chris, because everybody has been asking me how long they can live, Connor and Sophia. So I'm really glad that you got to this. I have to say that we seem to be split. We have a lot of folks saying B, for example, Vivian and James and Raven and Connor and Daniel and Samara are all saying that they think a horseshoe crab lives 20 years, but we're also getting quite a few people saying that they think it's 30 years. So James is saying 30 years, Ellie is saying 30 years, Sarah. So I think most people think B, but it's split between B and C.
Okay, that's good. Good work, everybody. The actual answer is about 20 years. And again, this is not a hard and fast rule. This is an average, right? So we might get a few adults that live to only to be 17, 18 years old. And then we might get some adults that live to be 23, 24 years old. So we get a range there, and 20 years is about average. Okay, so good job, everybody. Thanks for playing along. Obviously, I threw that 20 million years in there. That is not even close. So well done. So mortality. Unfortunately, some of these things don't make it at various stages in their life. So on average, a mature female will lay about 80 to 90,000 eggs per season. And that's about maybe 20 nests per season, per summer, and about 4,000 eggs per nest. But unfortunately, only about 10 of those 80 to 90,000 eggs will make it to maturity. Some just don't hatch, right? We just have eggs in the beach that just don't make it for whatever reason, just unfavorable conditions. Things just weren't right for that egg to hatch. Sometimes we have predation before they're hatched as those eggs, and predation by shorebirds, which we'll talk about sort of in depth here in a second. Predation after they're hatched in that first year. So fishes, whelks, sea turtles, all these different things are eating the real young, tiny horseshoe crab. You can see some of the, again, those pictures there, a picture there of the eggs. Adult horseshoe crabs. This is a different story, right? So these things have made it now to 10 years old. They're out there in Delaware Bay. They've moved back into Delaware Bay to start their spawning process. And not much can eat an adult horseshoe crab. Some sea turtles maybe, but for the most part, they don't have many predators, which is really neat. Unfortunately, humans tend to be the biggest cause of mortality as adults. And that's through a couple different mechanisms. Habitat loss is one. We enjoy building on the beaches. We change the beaches in different ways. And that results in unfavorable conditions for those egg nests. And that's just, it's not good for the species when we start to mess with the beach a lot. Up until the 1970s, folks collected horseshoe crabs for fertilizer. They would go to a central processing plant. They'd be collected off the beach, go to the processing plant, and ground up into a powder, which farmers would then use on their land. And then an interesting one there, the conch, whelk, or eel as eel bait. So these are fisheries, particularly here off of Delaware, where folks are catching whelks, also known as conchs, and I have a picture here of one. This is a knobbed whelk, right? So the classic sort of perfect beach shell to collect. This has a critter in it known as a knobbed whelk, right? So that's a whelk. And we collect those, we harvest those commercially for food products and other things. And a great bait, unfortunately, for whelks and eels is horseshoe crab. Okay? And so there's another picture of a whelk there that shows some of its internal and external anatomy. And you can see in this picture on the right, that's a mesh bait bag with a half a horseshoe crab in it. And so these whelks will smell that horseshoe crab, again, not with noses, but with other sensors, and move into that trap where they think they're going to get a dead horseshoe crab meal. And some do. And so here's a stunning picture from the 1920s from the Delaware Public Archives that show just how many of these animals were collected for the fertilizer industry. By the thousands, okay? And it's just an incredible, I can't imagine what this smelled like after a few days, but there's a lot of horseshoe crabs that were collected and eventually turned into fertilizer. The interesting thing about this picture is I want you to notice the size of these horseshoe crabs. They're enormous. I've seen a lot of horseshoe crabs in my day. I have never seen a horseshoe crab this size. And I think that lends to sort of, we've selected for large horseshoe crabs over time through the bait and the fertilizer industries. And so we actually see a smaller individual now than we used to maybe 100 years ago. It's super interesting. But science steps in. How do we eliminate the need for bait? Eliminate the need of using horseshoe crabs for bait scientifically. And so there you see a group of folks. I want you to sort of focus on the woman in the middle there, Dr. Nancy Target, who over time, through her research, developed a recipe for horseshoe whelk and eel bait that uses less horseshoe crab. It still uses some, but the number that needed for the bait, it goes way down. And so you can see that chunk of stuff in front of her, looks like delicious peanut butter fudge or something, is actually whelk and eel bait. You probably don't want to eat it. It's got bits of horseshoe crab in it. And then through chemistry and biology, she's developed this recipe, this alternative bait that reduces the number of horseshoe crabs needed. It's really neat. So I'm going to stop there again and take any questions that have popped up.
Great. Well, Chris, if you know our audience at all, you'll know that, of course, I have more questions for you.
Absolutely.
Chris and another Chris and Cohen have been asking, as well as some other people, are they endangered?
That's a great question. They are not endangered. In fact, because of the importance to the environment and to humans, which I'll get into in a little bit, they are highly monitored, and there's a lot of policy out there that limits the number of horseshoe crabs that can be taken for some of the uses we'll talk about in a minute. But very regulated, and very much that population is under the microscope. And one of the cool things, one of the research projects that Delaware Sea Grant is involved in is a horseshoe crab spawning survey. And so this time of year, folks from Delaware Sea Grant and partners will go out on the beach and count the number of horseshoe crabs that they see. And that's happening all over Delaware Bay beaches. It's happening on the New Jersey side and Delaware side. It happens down in the inland bays in Delaware. It happens in other states. And something that you can be involved in if you're interested is this horseshoe crab spawning survey. And so those numbers that everyone collects, these volunteers collect, goes into a huge database, and they develop policies on how many horseshoe crabs can be taken and not hurt the population. That's a good question.
Great. Now we have a couple of folks, Raven is asking this, and Kyle is asking this, and a few others have asked in the past, where's the most common place where they live? And I think folks are wondering, like, where would you find them? And what's the best time of year to see them? Can you see them coming and spawning? I know you told us when, but like, where would we see them?
Yep, so typically the ocean beaches with that high wave energy are not good places to see them. We want to focus our attention on what are typically called bay shore or sound shore beaches. Again, it's North Carolina Sounds, Delaware Bay, Chesapeake Bay. Some of those what were called low energy systems. So the waves, they have waves, but they're tiny little waves instead of the big crashing waves. And those horseshoe crabs don't like those big crashing waves because they're trying to move up on the beach and lay their eggs. And so if you can find saltwater, low energy beaches, that's where you're going to find the horseshoe crabs. Now, again, that range from Maine all the way to Louisiana, depending on where you are there, it's going to change when this happens, right? So down in warmer climates, that you take that peak season that I outlined in that calendar, and you sort of backtrack it. So into maybe early April to mid-June. Up in Maine, where it's a lot colder, that water's a lot colder, you can see a shift slightly to later in that calendar. So maybe late May to late June. So it depends on where you are and the time of year, definitely.
Great. And I love this question, so I'm glad that someone asked this. Duncan, one of our regulars, what's your favorite part of your job?
The favorite part of my job, without question, is getting out and seeing these things in nature, right? So my job as an educator, I have the luxury of doing programs for students, for adults, on all sorts of topics. And so I love getting out there on the water or on the beach and just beachcombing or seining or doing trawling and collecting these different things, looking at them, studying them, and then putting them back, using them for education if need be, and then putting them back into the water. By far, that's my favorite. Good question.
Great. And then another question that I think is interesting, since you're sharing the scientific name, Aoife and Cullum are wondering, what does Limulus polyphemus mean?
Yeah,
because usually there's some Latin background to that name.
Yep. So the limulus part actually means sort of off-centered, which is kind of interesting. And then the latter part, polyphemus, is as a Greek personality, Greek person in history that was rumored to have a single eye. So if you put those two pieces together, crooked center eye, I don't know how it fits. I don't know who came up with that. It's a couple hundred years old at this point, that name. But it's an interesting thing to look up, definitely, and read more about. Good question.
Great, and a lot of people are asking this. So Cohen is the one that most recently asked it, but do people eat them?
Yeah. So there are some cultures on our planet that will harvest these and eat them. I have never sampled them myself. I'm not really sure which parts people eat, but I'm guessing sort of the legs. Maybe there's probably some muscle around the telson or tail that is edible. But there's some cultures that definitely eat them, but I have never sampled them. I don't intend to anytime soon.
Great. And can you tell their age just by the size of their shell? Well, let me just read you the question. Sarah asks, how do you determine how old one is other than the amount of shells that are accumulating, sort of growing on top of it?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The size is probably the easiest way to go. And again, you see something that's about a ½ inch or maybe an inch, you can guess that it's about a year old-ish to maybe 2 years. And then sort of from there, again, I have this one here that's probably on the order of maybe 5 or 6. And then if you see something that's crawling around the beach that's this size, you can bank on it being probably between that 10 and 20 years old. range. Again, once they do what's called their terminal molt, which is when they're mature, they will not molt again. And so they'll carry that shell for upwards of 10 years, which is how all that stuff starts to collect on it. So if you see a shell with just a ton of limpets and barnacles and things growing on it, you know that horseshoe crab is probably 18, 19, 20 years old even.
Great. Now, of course, I still have more questions, but I know you have a lot more to share, so I'm going to let you go on, and I'm going to pause with the questions. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for your question. So we are going to move forward. It's an important part of the horseshoe crab story coming up next. At first glance, this picture might look like complete chaos. But if you zoom in or sort of focus your attention, you'll see that this is a mass of shorebirds. These are all birds in there. That is, again, an interesting part of this story. Each year, about 425 to 1 million migratory shorebirds move through Delaware Bay on their way from Central and South America to the Arctic for breeding. And it's an incredible thing because about 11 species will move through Delaware Bay for one reason, and that's to feed on horseshoe crab eggs, sorry. And so here are just some of the species. I mentioned 11, this is not 11, but different sizes, all kind of the same shape. And I have an interesting video here that I want to show you that shows these shorebirds on the beach feeding on eggs. This was created a few years ago, 2014, but this has been happening for hundreds of years, and it's happening right now on Delaware Bay shores. So you can see all these little birds moving around, they're picking through the sand to find those horseshoe crab eggs that are very high in fat. And so these birds that are migrating from Central and South America to the Arctic need that fat to sustain them until they get to their destination. And so you can see them, it's quite a spectacle. Go at night to see the horseshoe crab spawning, and then during the day, you can see all these shorebirds that are up feeding. Super, super neat to watch. One of those species of birds is called the red knot. That's where that red knot in the title comes from. This is a species of bird that is endangered. So folks have asked that question about horseshoe crab. But these red knots are highly endangered. And so there's a lot of research that's done about red knots. And you can see there's some things on its legs that do not hurt the birds in any way. But these are tags. On the sort of right side of the screen, you see a yellow tag. That just includes a series of letters and numbers that identify that bird. So somewhere in the database of all these bird tags is, I think, what's it, like V8J or something. I think that's what it says. So in that database are stats on when this bird was first captured and tagged, and they do size and weight and any scars or anything like that, and where it was tagged. And then every time that bird is seen again, people can report it, and it goes into that database, and they know where these birds move throughout the course of their life. On the left side of the screen there, you see a geolocator. This is a super interesting piece of technology. So that has a little GPS tracker in it that is attached to the leg. Again, doesn't hurt the bird in any way. It's attached to that leg, and it can actually geolocate. It can tell scientists exactly where this bird is on the planet, which is really neat. So here's another red knot. It's a super interesting red knot. It's one of the most interesting stories about a red knot or about a bird that I've ever heard. And this is B95, and you can see that tag is labeled B95. And it's also called the moonbird, which I'll ask you about in a second. It was first tagged in Argentina in February 1995, and it was last seen in New Jersey in May of 2014. So 19 years, this bird was moving around, again, from South America up to the Arctic every year. So a question for you all, you can type it right in the chat box, is why do you think B95 is called the moonbird? And while you're typing that, I'll just mention that this moonbird has been called the toughest 4 ounces on the planet.
Okay, so great question. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but why is B95 called the moonbird? What's your guess? Why do you think that they gave that nickname to? So Eliana thinks that maybe B95 is code for the moon. Luke thinks that maybe the bird is using the moon to navigate. And Sarah thinks maybe it's because it has lived for many moons. Chris and Lindy and Angela think maybe it's because it either feeds or it flies at night. Sloan is saying maybe because it's nocturnal. And yeah, a lot of folks are thinking maybe it's because it feeds or it flies mostly at night.
Okay, I love those answers. Those are super imaginative answers. And there's some truth to some of them. They use stars sometimes for navigation, the magnetic poles for navigation.
I have to interrupt you, Chris, because Sophia said the distance it's flown is the same length it takes to go to the moon.
Who was that, Sophia?
Sophia.
Well done, Sophia. You're the closest. And so it's been measured or calculated that Moonbird has flown over 400,000 miles, which is, as some of you may know, is the distance to the moon from Earth and more than halfway back. So it got this moniker of Moonbird. So I encourage you to look up and learn more about Moonbird. Unfortunately, we don't think it's still around, but there's some books, there's movies. Here's a map that's been created about Moonbird's migration. So you can see it was tagged down here in Argentina, in South America, and it's taken all these flights over the course of 19 years up right through Delaware Bay. Okay, I'm circling with my mouse, and up into the Arctic where it breeds. And then after breeding season, once it gets colder again, it will migrate right back to South America. Okay. So I'm going to stop there and take maybe a question or two, just in the interest of time. I don't want to get bogged down in questions, but Grace, if there's one more question about migration or anything, I'm happy to answer that.
Yeah, so this is not necessarily about migration, but people have asked it a couple times. Is there a gender that is more common? Do you tend to see more male or female horseshoe crabs, and how can you tell the difference?
Yep, so telling the difference is sometimes easy. Size is one way, right? So the females tend to be bigger, but then I'm going to flip this over, and you might be able to see her first claws, female's first claws, look like the legs or the claws of the rest of the animal. In males, this first claw will look more like a boxing glove with a hook on the end. And they use that claw to hook onto the female during spawning season. And so if you see that boxing glove, that's a telltale sign that that's a male. Yeah. And what was the other question?
Oh, it was just, do you tend to see more male or female horseshoe crab?
Yeah. So up on the beach in those piles, you tend to see more males. And that's simply because the females tend to be buried either under the sand or under all those females. And so the ratio is about equal, about 50-50-ish. But when you're seeing them on the beach, you're definitely seeing more males. It's a good question. So I'm going to go back and continue on the story. So I've mentioned the ecological importance of horseshoe crabs. I've mentioned them as bait and fertilizer, but they have a tremendous value to humans in terms of their medical uses. As I mentioned earlier, their eye is not exactly like ours, but it's very similar. And so they are used a lot in eye research. Their chitin in their shell is used for suture materials, which are also known as stitches. You might know them as stitches. And those stitches that you might get that are dissolvable, that sort of dissolve in your skin, are often made from chitin. And then this last one, this LAL, Limulus amoebocyte lysate, that's perhaps the most important part to humans about horseshoe crabs. For those that aren't aware, horseshoe crab blood is copper-based. Unlike our blood, which is iron-based, it gives it its red color. Horseshoe crab blood is blue and is copper-based, and it has a blue color. Now, this LAL that's in the horseshoe crab blood is a clotting agent. And it's super important when we're trying to detect toxins in vaccines, in intravenous medicine, and prosthetic devices, such as heart valves and hip replacements and knee replacements. So they coat that prosthetic, or they add this LAL to vaccines, and if it binds, you can see a clump, that means there's a toxin in there, and that's not good. And so whatever the item is, needs to be either cleaned or diluted or something. So it's super important. And it's so important that 1 quart, which is about one of those bottles in front of you on that picture, is worth about $15,000. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't say you should not try this at home. Do not try to bleed a horseshoe crab, please. This is done by experts and is highly regulated. So please do not try that. So, helping horseshoe crabs. There are things that you can do either right now or depending on where you are, or with parents' permission or with your parents to help horseshoe crabs. First and foremost, go see them. I have talked about them for almost an hour now, but until you see a horseshoe crab in real life, you hold it, that you look at it, you observe it, you are not going to have the appreciation for horseshoe crabs that you do when you're doing it. Okay? So go see them. They're, like I said, they're in beaches all over the place on the East Coast, low energy beaches, and you can see a horseshoe crab. Participate in a horseshoe crab survey. That's what these folks in this picture are doing. They are counting the numbers of males and females that they observe in that white square, which is called a quadrant. And those data then go into forming policies. If you're on the beach and you see one of these horseshoe crabs that's stranded, it's upside down, it might be wiggling, check and make sure it's alive first, okay? And if you see some movement, again, it can't hurt you. You can put your hand right here on its legs and claws. It can't pinch you. There's no venom. We want to return these to the water's edge very carefully. You never, ever, ever want to hold it by the telson or tail. It can damage the tail, or if the horseshoe crab feels in danger, it can actually eject the tail. And we've learned that the tail is super important for swimming and for righting itself. And so we don't want it to lose its tail. We don't want it to stress. So what we do is we pick them up like a big cereal bowl. We carry them like this down to the water's edge. We flip them over. There's a cool video that I'll link to at the end there. The Just Flip Them video, you flip them over, you place them at the water's edge, and you let them be on their way. And then the second to last item there is protecting their spawning beaches. As I mentioned, without these beaches, places to nest, we won't have future horseshoe crabs. Okay, so we need to protect those beaches. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention that these horseshoe crabs have inspired folks for generations. And so I encourage you to check out some of the horseshoe crab art that exists. So on the top left there is some drawings done by a friend, Abby Shepard. It's a great Instagram feed. She takes lots of great pictures of horseshoe crabs and is drawing them and painting them. It's super cool stuff. Horseshoe crab origami, so you can take a piece of paper and fold it to make your own horseshoe crab. For those that are extra, I don't know what the right word is, creative and love horseshoe crabs a lot, you can make your own horseshoe crab costume, seen there in the lower left. Those are her legs sticking out in the back there, if you can see that. And then perhaps one of the most interesting is painting horseshoe crab shells. So you can see some of the art that this gentleman has created on the backs of horseshoe crabs, which is pretty stunning. So that's all I have. For more information, I encourage you to check out that bit.ly link there, which will take you to the Woods Hole Sea Grant site for all these webinars. And there's some really great resources that I've included there, including the Horseshoe Crab 15-Second Sciences. There's a whole series of 15-second science that my organization produces. That horseshoecrab.org is a great resource. It has everything you could ever possibly want to know about horseshoe crabs. And then Delaware Bay HSCsurvey.org. That is the homepage of the horseshoe crab spawning survey. So there's a bunch of data there. There's information about horseshoe crabs. There's contacts if you want to join a survey. Great resources that are linked there. And so with that, I'm happy to take more questions. I know we're getting short on time, but happy to answer more questions. So thank you all for this opportunity to talk to you about one of my favorite critters. And I hope that you have developed your own interest and like for horseshoe crabs, and we'll get out there and check them out.
Thank you so much, Chris. We are getting a little short on time. I know there were some questions that maybe we didn't get to, but I encourage our students to sort of look those up and do some research as well. But I know I speak for everyone because we've been getting it through the chat box at how appreciative we are and how knowledgeable you are about horseshoe crabs and how much you've shared. Anyone who wants to see any of the videos that Chris shared, just to reiterate what he said, it's on the NOAA Live website. So if you go to the Woods Hole Sea Grant NOAA Live website, you can see some videos he didn't share. So go ahead and take a look. But any he did share are there, as well as all those resources he's listed on his website. Now, I know that the class that's watching was wanting to know your Instagram. I think you mentioned your Instagram, and so maybe we can put on the website what your Instagram feed is so they can follow you. So thank you so much. Just really great to see that. The origami that Chris mentioned as well is on the NOAA Live website. If you have more patience than I do and you want to make a horseshoe crab origami, if you do, please send me a picture because I would love to see that. My email is on the NOAA Live website, Grace Simpkins, but if anyone does the origami, please, please, please send me a picture. So thanks again, Chris. And I just want to give a shout out for our Monday webinar. We're going to have Ryan Friedman. He's going to be talking about giant sea bass. He's located at the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. So that's going to be a really fun talk as well. So if you haven't already, go ahead and check out our listings for next week and sign up for some of our webinars. And I think that's it. A lot of people are just saying thanks so much, and I'm just going to second that and say I will see all of you on Monday. Thanks so much for tuning in today, and thanks again, Chris.
Yep, thank you all. Take care, everybody.